everybody, and welcome to the continuing lecture series here at the Center for New Art, supported in part by the graduate and the undergraduate art department. Later on in the show, if you want to ask a question, please make sure that you get the microphone because we're recording this, and it goes on the New Jersey Vid or NJVid website, and so you can access it at another time. Next week, of course, at the same time, same place, we have a lecture with Matthew Epler and another artist and also somebody who's starting an archive for digital media work done on the internet. So he's an interesting guy in his own right, and then at the same time, he's got a larger project having to do with digital media and its expressions. Excuse me, I walked all the way from down there. There we go. Today, we're really lucky to have with us two gentlemen who are both extremely accomplished in their own right. Charles Tucker is a sculptor, and Saul Ostrow is a polymorph. All right? Actually, Charles is also a polymorph, but I'm going to read a little bit from their bios. Charles Tucker is an artist and researcher actively working toward an aesthetic research methodology, a goal that he has investigated since the mid-1990s. The work utilizes a rhetorical model of aesthetic investigation and cultural production. To date, the work has been responsible for several collaborative art productions, most notably the Rhetorical Object and the Aesthetic Compass. Collectively, these works serve as virtual devices for the express purpose of mapping aesthetic information, specifically artistic production. And Saul is an independent critic and curator, the art editor at large for Bomb magazine. In 1996, after having exhibited nationally and internationally for over 20 years, he terminated his studio practice. He has also served as a co-editor of Lusitania Press and as the editor of the book series Critical Voices in Art, Theory and Culture, published by Routledge in London. As a curator, he has organized over 70 exhibitions in the United States and abroad. His writings have appeared in art magazines, journals, catalogs, and books in the United States and Europe. In 2010, he founded the not-for-profit Critical Practices, Inc. to promote critical discourse and practices. Its core programs are 21st Street Projects, which sponsors viewing of artists' works, and a La Table Ronde, initiated in 2012, which organizes roundtable discussions on on critical, theoretical, and cultural issues. And LEF, in parentheses T, a broadsheet publication consisting of test and visual projects. Without further ado, please welcome me in welcoming our guests.
I'm going to try to move us through this fairly smoothly. The project that Charles and I were involved in, which is still open-ended, we just haven't gotten back to it, started 2008, 2009. It started really simply. It was the question of asking, how do you determine this if an artwork has a subject? Right? And it would seem simple that one answers it by looking at the piece and goes, it's made up of squares, obviously the subject of it's the relationship between squares. Or it's a picture of a dog and therefore the subject. But this is not the type of subject that we were concerned with. We were concerned with all of the mechanisms that sit behind that image, right? And we had a certain number of premises. One premise that we started with was for 500 years, despite the intellectual skills, changing technologies and values that manifest themselves in stylistic conceptual shifts, art was represented as constituting a fixed body of skills, knowledge, and standards. This resulted in art being traditionally manifested through a variety of media-based skills such as painting, sculpture, printmaking, and then with time adopting and adapting new media such as photography, film, video, etc. What we were really interested in and what we set out to do was create more or less a database of the work of art, meaning how much could we index in terms of what structured that object or that work, right? We started making lists. We took the simplest things. We tried to do away with any of our assumptions because the idea was that everything that went onto that list should be tested rather than assumed, that everything that went onto that list was not necessarily what one would necessarily imagine should be on that list. We kept adding terms, and not conventional terms. We kept trying to find the technical equivalencies of certain ideas or the limit of that idea. A lot of times you'll notice on these boards that we're involved in a process of almost like a thesaurus, in which it's like, okay, here we have a term, here's its equivalent, here it stops functioning. Occasionally we would come up with a hypothesis. Art is an observation. Right? Art is an observation about art. Intelligible absences, material presences, representations, hypotheses and speculations, theories and proofs, theorems. This was the notion that the artwork is not just a fixed object, that it functions as in a manner as a device, as an apparatus, that it carries significant content beyond those sort of narratives that we imagine or that we engage in interpretation. These lists, as you can see, became somewhat expansive. The notion here being that one list fed on another list, in which the idea was that we were no longer dealing with something that had a definition, we were actually seeking its definition. Because the existent definition couldn't and wasn't able to contain all the things that we, from our experiences as artists and theorists, had found it to be. Another one of our hypotheses was that modernism's intensive interrogation of these assumptions reveal that art is not a fixed category or a discipline, but a body of nomadic knowledge that results from a process of conceptual and aesthetic experimentation, interrogation, integration, and self-reflection and skills. When modernism's assumptions that the essential nature of art lay in originality, innovation, and criticality came under review, it was proposed that art was more a cultural construct. Art was set free from its history. This is about the 1970s, 80s. Now, one of the things, because Charles and I were both teaching art, was we realized that to a certain degree, a lot of what we taught was residual. It was old ideas, no matter how much we were committed to moving things forward, not having self-reflexively evaluated much of what we taught. We just kept piling things up on that which we had inherited. And this set of dialogues between he and I gave us the opportunity to very much do a house cleaning. Seek out and figure out which of those terms actually still remained relevant? Which of those concepts still remained relevant? Which notion of art was still useful to us, rather than just replicating that which we had both been taught? One of the conclusions we drew at that time, and as you see, these lists extend and keep shifting as new terms and information are introduced, was that art's inherent value resided in the fact that the skills and practices of art making are indeterminate because they are under constant adjustment and revision as they adapt to changing social and cultural conditions brought about by changing material conditions. The result is a multimedia, multidisciplinary process whose standards and criteria elude quantification. Meaning that we were dealing with the notion that art was a concept. It was not a form. It was something we, as artists, sought to give form to, something we were committed to making real or object, rather than assuming that we were working within a set of predefined parameters. So we understood that our ideas of art were divergent, convergent, and recursive. Recursive meaning that it stored and brought back certain ideas. That art, to a great extent, as not in its making, but in its conception, was a process. How we thought about it, how we received it, how we used it, how it might be used, what it might generate, so on and so forth. All of which, given what we were attempting to do, we immediately set aside our known answers to those things so that we might ask the question, what else or how else? All right. Art is the surplus produced by an act, recursive and reflexive system of research whose emergent subjects are form as material thought. The notion that what we do is we go from ideas to their manifestation, their presentation, how best to present them, what is the nature of the idea, so that we come to the question of what is the nature of its presentation. And within that, the question of what does it represent. Premise. Art is comparable to that of philosophy and science, and can be thought of as a practice that develops heuristically, in that it participates in the making both complete and collaborative in its defining. Heuristically means by trial and error. There's no formula for making art. There's no set of parameters or givens. There's a set of conditions that we as artists inherit, and then by trial and error we attempt to understand those conditions, those terms, and extend them or employ them to some end. The reason for this is that art is an adaptable form of knowledge generation. And after modernism, it has no specific form or content. This is because with each shift in attention, not intention, but attention, how we look at things, what we focus on, the artist is confronted on the level of form, content, subject, media with the problems whose resolution lies beyond the ability of any single system or discipline's capacity to mediate and order its economy. The notion here was that the work of art is not a thing in the singular, but a multiplicity, that it deals with differing systems, multiple meanings, part of which are brought to it by the artist, and part of which are the conditions under which the artist produces, and part of them are the conditions under which the art is viewed. So there's those things you can seemingly or think you can control. There are those that you can't. There are those that inform your sense of self. And then there's the oddity, which is the person who comes to read or interpret your work of art. The work of art. Now, often we assume that the goal of the viewer is to interpret the intention of the artist. But the intention of the artist is not necessarily always available. What we have is the evidence of what the artist has made with that intention. So as you see, slowly we're moving away from the notion of maker, object, viewer. And we're seeing that as an interactive system, right? Each one defining and contributing to the overall economy. Given the complexity of this, and this is where Charles and I enter into this, is where does one begin to try to understand such a complex systems network? In the middle, and the answer we found for ourselves, this is obviously we're not involved in universal answers, was the place where you start is in the middle. Because seemingly there is no beginning. So we began naively with the simple question, what is a subject? This led to a series of propositions concerning art knowledge and research itself, which required us to draw on still other disciplines in order for us to understand understand art's forms and contents. To begin, the first problem was to create our subject. And that's what these lists represent. That we recognize that pretty much out of our conversations that there wasn't a ready-made subject for the work of art. That there was, and that one of the big problems, and Charles will be talking to you about that, is how do we determine or figure out that a subject is locatable? And that often we've found that there are works, in quote, that have no subject or partial subject, and therefore they're ambiguous or they collapse into a sort of two-dimensionality. They don't become a network of interpretations. To do this, we found we needed to design operational protocols that would function both self-reflexively and critically. Now the idea is, if we wanted to be honest in our research, we had to question everything we were proposing. We had to figure out some way to test it. We had to, in some manner, be the gatekeepers to our own thought. In the notion that this thing was being built piece by piece. It wasn't a pre-existing structure in which we were just going to go, okay, we're going to frame out the windows now, then we're going to frame out the doors, then we're going to call and get a prefab window, then we're going to get a prefab door, then we're going to put shingles on it. We didn't know what the thing was going to look like. We had actually started this thing with a proposition, but no presuppositions about what we would produce. Now, one of the things that was interesting was that at the very beginning, in terms of our initial conversations, we had determined that the work of art was a proposition, that art was an emergent subject, which constitutes a bundle of signifiers without fixed order or quantifiable fields of operations. It meant that we had come to agree and would test to see if that hypothesis functioned or not, that the work of art, though presented as a singularity, in actuality was an assemblage, and functioned as an assemblage on lots of different levels. In other words, it was unstable and continues to reveal aspects of itself over time, or at entropies. Therefore, works of art either were dynamic or entropic. They either expanded in terms of how we might interpret them, how we might receive them, how we might experience them, or had momentary life expectancies in which they collapsed and became something else. Given this assertion, we concluded that art was not a thing in itself, but analogous to other things and disciplines. That is, it was similar to the tools we were using to probe it. These being aspects of the sciences, linguistics, and philosophy. One of the things we had realized was that we could not use art criticism, art theory, or art history to investigate the work of art, because these already depended on a certain model of the work of art. That we needed to find other fields whose language, whose structure, whose practices would allow us to step outside of those fields that had already informed our vision of this thing, and see what happens when you put it under a totally different type of microscope, let's say, or a different type of optics, in which what you're really looking for is all the things that your knowledge conceals. All the things that if your assumptions are taken away from you, what do you put in its place? Subsequently, in trying to answer our question, patterns of information merged that resulted in the design of the aesthetic compass. The principal apparatus for achieving this was interdisciplinary structure of a freewheeling ongoing dialogue whose form and outcomes were not fixed but ever evolving. As such, we had entered into a process of trial and error. Once again, as if you notice from these boards, and I forget how many boards are there? 200 and something? There are about 200 and something boards. They're constantly evolving. Assumptions that we had made or decisions that we thought we had opened up whole new areas to us would be preserved for 2 or 3 boards, 2 or 3 days, and then we realized that we actually had to erase that because it was just taking up space. It didn't lead anyplace. There were days that we felt brilliant, only the next morning to sort of go, nah, that doesn't work. That doesn't take us anyplace. That actually takes us right back to where we started. One of the most important things that came with time was the understanding of the work of art as a rhetorical object. This term was a result of our interdisciplinary approach that permitted us to appropriate to our project structures and concepts existing within existent discourses. So the notion here was that the work of art speaks. How does it structure its speech? How does it structure its reception? Right? Now, ironically, the term rhetorical object is the invention of Victor Margolin and is derived from his discussions of the works made by the Russian productivists. For Margolin, these cultural producers, artists, were less interested in merging art and design than they were in the idea of modeling everyday life via a series of propositions that took the form of objects. So here was the notion that the work of art potentially is a model of something. It's not a representation of itself, nor is it a representation of some idea or emotion, but it's literally a model. The notion that it's a model is that it is in a manner a scaled down version of, once again, of an undefined economy. But also the term model also means to display. So we have the double meaning of it, that the work of art both displays something and gives order and form to something. The problem was, what does it give order and form to? As you can see, over the course of our working with these boards, increasingly we had to go to the abstract to give representation to our thoughts. More and more, less and less words, more and more diagrams. Many of the diagrams being borrowed from physics, theoretical mathematics, so on and so forth, because these were the only ways which we could give representation to some of the relationships that we had stumbled upon, revealed to ourselves, or found ourselves in need of reconsidering. The rhetorical object might be best thought of materially and conceptually as drawings. That is, something pulled from their source, abstracted, which in this case is a consequence of investigation and remodeling of the many aspects that form the general category of the art object, interfaced with that of the artwork, as it has come to exist within its everyday, and as it has come to exist in its everyday. Having discovered in full view both our subject and object, we set about compiling the means to do a comparative data analysis concerning its existence with the multidimensional reality it may delineate. The notion here was we now had a model of the work of art. We now needed to see how that functioned and relative to what. In that, to a great extent, we had pulled the carpet out from under ourselves. We, to a certain degree, had no footing and now needed to build, actually in a funny way, build a ladder back down to land. We kept seeking in other disciplines the means and the manner by which to articulate the nature of the object that we had come to, the nature of our thought object, as well as how it might be spatially locatable. So obviously the problem was to begin to identify relations. Central to our discussion was the recognition that our premise necessitated the development of a methodology that was analogous to science and differs from that of the humanities. Once having come to this hypothesis, our first objective was mapping those as yet unrecognized or insufficiently recognized or unconsidered modes of experience, signification, and interpretation relative to the work of art as both form and concept. So literally it was, we have this object, we call it the rhetorical object. What is its component parts? If we take it apart, can we put it back together? Slowly over the course of that, obviously, what's beginning to emerge, and we had never thought of this, we had never thought of an actual device. This all started off as a thought experiment. From our notations, from the need to diagram things that some of our ideas could only be pictured, they couldn't be described, they couldn't be articulated in any other manner, we began to recognize that a certain configuration, a certain device could help us in our research. Right? So now the question was, how might we determine if something had a subject? Or was it possible to make something whose subject was incomplete? We turned to exploring the possibilities of creating a theoretical device that was comparable of mapping and framing that was capable of mapping and framing the subject. For a moment, we also had to step back because, as I said, we had thrown ourselves into a void. This wasn't a whiteboard. This was done on a pad. But we were trying to locate, we literally had to make this map of various and sundry disciplines to try to figure out where we were located, where our practice was located, what we were drawing sources from, and what the nature of our universe was. Likewise, this sort of diagram of the fields of engagement that we thought we were involved in and their direction, right? So if you notice, we also began to think about aesthetics as a form of ecology. Anybody know what ecology is? No? Yes? What? Ecosystem? You can't use a term to define itself. What's ecology? What's an ecosystem?
It's a balanced system with different parts that kind of feed into each other to support each other.
Right, exactly. It's a system of circulation and exchange. Has not necessarily anything to do with nature. Economy, economics, so on and so forth. We began to think about aesthetics as a system, as not something that was value added or that came from taste, but literally part of the machinery. That it too created either a set of conditions in terms that had affect with an A rather than effect, affect being consequences, which also began to become a really important aspect of our thinking. Increasingly, and I know these sentences get increasingly complex, but our thinking was getting increasingly complex, and our thinking was increasingly becoming scientific. The terms that we were using, as I said, were basically terms coming from things like quantum physics, theoretical mathematics, philosophy, the sciences, linguistics, and the cognitive sciences. So we realized that to create our subject, cognitive acts had to be objectified, made quantifiable, and data had to be mined so as to diverge information previously unconsidered. As such, the dialogue between theory and practice became the means by which to establish a process that operates at the interface of the traces of quantitative and qualitative data, which represent a complex decision made concerning the thing under discussion. The notion here is that when you look at the work of art, you're looking at traces of a series of decisions that were made by the artist. Just traces. And that we as viewers, we as discerners, we as those who are engaged with this object are in the business of basically analyzing trace elements. And coming to an understanding of how they make a composite. Right? So in order to do that, we ended up having to make a set of rules for ourselves, a set of parameters, beginning to define a territory in which we were operating. One of the important things that we came through was the notion, and it came through the notion of the rhetorical object, that every object has two types of narratives. One continuous, it's what it is, unfragmentable, takes place simultaneously all at once, but in a manner that becomes the raw material for our acts of interpretation, because what we do is we take the continuous and fragment it. We take the continuous and try to break it up, reassemble it into some manner that we can understand, that we can comprehend. We break it up, on one hand, in part through our comprehension, and on the other part, through how that narrative challenges our comprehension. So this was our way of trying to think through and formulate how one might measure that relationship. And one of the things we end up with here is content analysis and interpretation as three separate entities rather than one act, rather than the component parts of one act. I at various times talked about analogy, right? The notion was that we could, in a manner, begin to find comparable structures in these differing disciplines. And that somehow those structures could be made or applied to the work of art. Again, you'll notice There's repetition here in terms, the two boards look like they're probably exactly the same, but we're in the constant process of adjusting, changing small things that require us to adjust other things in an endless process of revision. For us, the rhetorical object, given its propositional nature, seemingly occupied the identical space of the work of art. Seeking to identify the validity and multi-system of assessment, we sought to produce the tools that would in turn allow us the identification of patterns, of assumptions that had come to be replicated in our knowledge. We now saw this device as a device that would actually interrogate us. That our assumptions would now be challenged by this device, by what we had come to understand. So it wasn't all out from the maker into the world. It was out from the maker into the world and back to the maker, challenged by what they had made. So it wasn't the notion of a single message being sent out and being intercepted by somebody. It was a message sent out that comes back to you, because everything you do, or everything we did during this period, ended up having consequences both in our own practices, because once again, Charles is a sculptor, I'm a critic and a curator. We ended up using the information that we generated from this process in two different ways, as well as developing this device, which then put us in terms of challenging what we had previously done. We were now in the position of literally going, oh, look at how stupid that was when I did that. Because I never questioned this or this or this. And while everybody might have liked it, by not being aware of this, I was not able to advance the position. One of the things, and Charles will talk a lot about in terms of that, is that part of what came out of this was the notion that there's always a position to be advanced. The information that comes from this type of analysis allows you, or hopefully allows you, to advance the position. So the whole notion was that the structure that we were dealing with was always transformative. Not about merely objectification, but literally every time you objectify something, you've changed the terms by which you're engaged in that thing. So, intense periods of constructing inventories, quantifications and abstractions, and then finally summations. That we had identified not a device, but a system of interlinking systems of devices, one to frame, one to measure, one to locate, differing aspects of this thing that we called the work of art. And the work of art here also has a double meaning, because it's not just the object work, but it's also the notion that the artwork does labor or performs a service or does something. It's not an inert, inactive thing. All right. So, where I'm going to leave you is with the notion that we had assembled a series of propositions. The next step, and that's what Charles will be talking about, is how these actually got assembled into usable devices. How all this theoretical work was only part of the work. If we could not apply it, it was fantasy. Thank you.
The second half of this really is going to be, I don't want to say more technical. I would say it's going to deal with some technical aspects of what we were doing, but it's going to try to pull it into a framing mechanism that talks about not only what we did with this information, but also then demonstrates some of the usages that can come out of this process. The image that you're looking at right now is strictly an illustration. The device that Saul referred to, that we later sort of dubbed the aesthetic compass, ended up being this little item right here. And it's a visualization that allows us to kind of map and model discursive space. So essentially, from my perspective as a sculptor, I think of the discursive, this idea of a place of discourse, as more than just a conversation, but culturally speaking, something that has dimensionality. I like to first start with the 3D, so I'm thinking of it as a three-dimensional space, but very quickly I think we both come to understand that we're actually talking about something that's more multidimensional than that. So we start to refer to things as occurring in 4 dimensions rather than just 3. And by the 4th dimension, we're not necessarily speaking about animation or sequential. We're really talking about more of a geometric or a mathematic idea of 4th dimension. So the idea of a 4D cube like the tesseract or something like that is a component part of the thinking behind it. This little visualization will pop up again and again, not in this form, but the terms that are associated with it and the space that it represents will be part of the ongoing sort of conversation. I just wanted to give you that image because it's an image that we play with pretty often. I know I'm always looking at it. And this is probably for maybe Saul and myself, the inside joke. But early on, we tried to figure out how we understood that one of the things we were always dealing with was a temporal condition. And for a long time, I was referring to that as, you know, sort of past and present and future. And at a certain point, Saul was very clear that I couldn't go that route, and we needed to come up with something that did not allude to this this kind of idea of the spatial condition. And so from that point on, we began to think about things in terms of before and after. So in this moment, we literally stand before the event, and then at the end of that presentation moment, we're in the after of it to give you a sense of it. So within all things that we're experiencing, there is the before, there is the thing itself, but then there's the after. So it sort of shifts the way we think about the temporal condition. Research in the visual arts and the production of new meaning was really what we were kind of after when we started our residency and started this whole project. The rhetorical method, another way to kind of think about it, it's a discursive process designed for aesthetic analysis and construction predicated on a practice that is both recursive, reflexive in its operation and condition. So this is a kind of underlying tenet. Saul's already mentioned some of these aspects. Normally I would say something like an aesthetic object, but in this case I really am talking about an art object, and that is the art object functions as a representation or of a multidimensional discursive condition within the contemporary cultural semiosphere. Lots of big words there. In a nutshell, what I'm trying to say is that an art object has a special case of categories. There are a lot of objects out there. We have aesthetic objects of all kinds. Art objects are a particular kind of object or aesthetic object. More recently, I've been looking at things within our modeling system. We have everyday objects, we have decorative objects, we have art objects. There are probably other classes of objects, but those are 3 just to name a few. And they have different characteristics and different qualities, and that's part of what our research kind of allows us to see. Another way to think about the art objects as just a simple visualization is to put it in the frame of the tesseract, which is this 4D cube. And the reason I use the 4D cube is because it's a multi-dimensional object in and of itself. So For us, this idea of content and expression as a visualization is really important within the framing of the presentation that I'm getting ready to hit you with. I think this is probably one of those more important things to understand about art objects. They exhibit a heterogeneous condition. We're dealing with content, and that content can be broken up into two categories or two kinds of aspects: vehicle and topic, and then there's expression, which we can break out into conveyance and context. This is really, really important because this condition doesn't exist in every object. So this is something specific to art objects in and of themselves. And that's kind of a unique thing if you think about it. Another way to visualize that, the same information, is to simply break it up like this. Now we're using this underlying information as a way to organize. So hierarchies are really important to us, a way to order the information. Otherwise, as you saw with all of our whiteboards, we've got a tremendous number of ideas, we've got a lot of writing, a lot of terms. How do we organize the information? Pedagogically speaking, we organize information all the time. It's a model, it's a structure for teaching, it's a structure for thinking, it's a way of investigation. But without them, we could end up with just lists and lists and lists of information. What's more important than the other? And part of our process was not only to make the list, not only to come up with ideas and think about things, but then to turn around and figure out a system for ordering it so that we could actually begin to examine. And the aesthetic compass kind of became our instrument, if you will, of analysis. And it was something we did not imagine ahead of time. We had no idea that this thing would ever pop out of the work that we were doing. It came about, as Saul spoke about, through this need to visualize what we were trying to explain to one another and to others. The words weren't there in a way that we could configure them to make sense of it, but we could draw it. We could make an image of it. Once we were able to generate some images that allowed us to explain things, it became much easier to start to understand it and then communicate. So oddly enough, and interesting enough, it started with image. This was an early version of the aesthetic compass as we were thinking about it at that time. It's actually broken up. This is a flat image, obviously, Illustrator, but it breaks up into 8 separate quadrants or space. It's an octet, okay? So it's a cube broken into 8 separate cubes. It's modeling space. It represents for us contextual conditions. So this is the contextual space of something, discursively speaking. And this is the compass that I showed you just a second ago, just a quick look at it. You can see the relationship between these two images to help illustrate that idea. Content and the ability to attract content, to formulate a subject, is where everything begins for us. And so sometimes, even today, you may have heard we ask the questions for some of you, what's the subject of the work? What are you thinking about? What is the work actually about? I'm always a big believer that, you know, the first thing you have to talk about is when you're asking or looking at someone's work, students' work, or whatever, is the understanding that art has an aboutness. It's about things. So that becomes a really important component for understanding what art is actually doing, any art. For us, one of the things we were trying to do was to come up with an understanding of how content even comes into being. What is your work about? I don't know what my work is about. Well, how do you know what you're doing? Well, I don't know. I think this is really cool. I like this information. This is a fascinating effect, and isn't that enough to make it art? And it may very well be, but ultimately someone, if you don't do it, someone's going to end up determining what the subject of that work is based on what you've done. So attracting the signifiers of a subject's content is really one of the problems that as an artist we wrestle with all the time. And understanding that that's what part of what we're doing was one of those important aha moments, I know for myself. With regard to expression, it works in tandem with the idea of the subject. Our ability to express identifies contextual locations for discursive placement. That means, where is this conversation occurring, and within what discourse or area of discourse or different kinds of discourses is this happening? Our little model that I showed you a minute ago, the aesthetic compass, basically gave us a framework for figuring out where artwork might be placed at different times. The more I know about the contextual space of a work, or the more I know about just contextual spaces in general in terms of the discursive, the better I have the opportunity to determine how I want to organize my artwork, what I want it to be made out of, how large it might be, even things down to uses of color or natural material. All of these things can come into play in terms of figuring out the work itself. So all of this information that you've been looking at collectively with Saul's conversation, and then what we actually do with that work, varies from case to case. We can take this information and our instrument of analysis, this little compass, and we could use it to look at a single work of art. We could use it to look at an entire class of artworks created at a specific time or over time. We could go into an artist studio and sit down with them and literally map out not only the artworks in their studio, but projects they're working on. Assuming that their artwork, the projects they're working on, have moved far enough along that they actually have identified a subject for their work. If they haven't identified their subject yet, they don't really know what the work's about, then the compass that I just showed you doesn't really have the capacity to map it. So this structure that we've set up for analyzing and interrogating artistic works has limitations, like any modeling device would. So our initial function is to really just identify the content, figure out what the content is. We do this by asking basically 4 kinds of questions. What does the work signify? What is the experience that you're trying to work with? What's the structure of the work? And to identify the technique that you're bringing to bear on it, or that you might want to bring to bear on it. Again, this can be proposed hypothetically, meaning something you're planning to do. You could literally sort of think your way through a project before ever beginning and get some feedback on it rather than just moving forward blindly. You could use it to examine a piece of artwork. You can also use it in other forms. It can be used for to look at, say, institutional structures. It could be in terms of decision making and how they set themselves up. It could be used for curriculum planning and those kinds of things if you want to bring it back to home in terms of an internal space. It has a lot of different kinds of uses depending on how you want to lay it out. What we ended up doing to sort of create a system for questioning and examination, analysis, is to come up with a series of devices that let us ask these questions. So the subject has an attraction to certain kinds of content, and it is totally dependent on the artist and their choices. So the artist is making the decisions. The agent is making the decisions for their creative work. What we're basically doing is arranging signification, experience, structure, and technique, and we're giving each one of these lines a weighted component. On the qualitative side, we're basically using ideas about grouping information, about the idea of the internal, the before, and the intuitive. And on the other end of this spectrum, and think of these as lines or spectrums, we have symmetry, external, after, and rational. And with each one of these, there's the term, there's a definition. So when someone's working through this or we're talking to them, we can literally go through and ask the question about their work, their subject, and how that plays out. Along with each one of these lines, there are more terms. We love terms, right? The whole idea behind this, if there are no terms, there's no art. Essentially, from our perspective, art is circumscribed by language. So we have to have a way of defining everything through our terminology. This is a particular level of terminology that we use a lot within the model. So when I'm working with someone and I'm talking to them about their work and I'm asking them questions, this is the level that I would use normally to sort of begin to interrogate the subject of their work. So in terms of signification, do you see your work in terms of the social, the ideological, personal, associative, narrative, relational, and so on with each one of these areas? The artist should be able to tell me where their work lies on each one of these things. They should be. Now, they may have to think about them a few minutes, and sometimes they may go, well, I'm not really sure. What do you mean by informational? And there's a definition for what informational means and its relationship to how you're ordering and realizing that work in terms of its structure. You'll notice over here under technique, we're not really concerned about high and low as though it's better or worse. We understand that there are some works that are highly refined because they need to be highly refined. Or they're highly refined because the artist that works that way only works that way. Everything that person produces is going to be highly refined because that's who they are, that's how they work. Other artists are much more likely to allow the project itself and the parameters of the project to dictate what's going on in the work. So they're not as concerned about refinement if the project issues and the project concerns don't need them to be. In some cases, it's completely dictated by the agent. Why did you do that? I don't know. I felt like it. It just felt like it should be blue. It could have been because that's all I had in my studio at the moment. But whatever the reason, the artist made the choice individually, so there's an individuated moment. And in some cases, technique, for example, is literally about as low as it could be. It's just adequate. It's adequate to the job that needs to be done. And it's not about a highly refined moment to communicate the information that we need. So those kinds of sort of breaking down each one of these lines to help determine the relationship of the subject of the work is used as kind of an analysis process. I don't use this one very often. This is an expanded version. When I'm using this one, I'm usually using it when I'm by myself and looking at work in more detail. And this goes back to the list of terms that Saul referred to. These are organized. These are the same lines I just showed you a minute ago. There are many, many terms on each one of these. If you remember the compass, it's broken down into an X, Y, Z axis. Along each one of those planes are lines. Each one of those lines can refer back to one of these kinds of transoms. So, content framing. Basically, we take these terms, we surround our subject, our unknown subject, our unidentified subject, and we attempt to see if the idea behind your work has enough weight, has attracted enough content to allow it to be an active subject. And we simply go through the questions that I just asked with each one of these terms. If you can activate each one of these lines and pull them towards the subject, then you've got a subject for your work. Almost in every case I've ever tried to measure a piece of existing artwork, it has a subject. The subject has either been determined by the artist, the agent, or it's been determined by the discipline itself, that the work is deeply embedded within the space of the discipline. So a subject exists. I have had on occasion artists invite me into their studio and they've got brand new work, new ideas. I sit down with them and at a certain point I realize I ask them a question about, say, for example, so experientially speaking, what is it you would like this, how would you like this work to operate? And they think about it a few minutes and they realize that they can't.
Just a second.
Certainly.
Let everybody, I don't want to interrupt you,
I'm good.
Give it a second.
This is a same content frame, it's just enlarged for people who sometimes have a problem seeing from the back, depending on the size of the audience. So the content framing is a fairly simple process in that sense. And this is the chart that I would normally work with you on. If I were framing someone's work, I'm going to basically ask the person to pick whether or not the work is a narrative, personal, ideological, social in terms of its signification. We're going to slide it along this scale. If we were to expand it out to the full 8 terms, they would simply fall in between those current terms. Sometimes someone will ask me, well, the work is a little bit liminal, but it also has a slight bit of criticality. Can I be in between? Well, it's adequate, but it's also artist-based. Yes, we're not looking for perfect measurement. What we're looking for is to get a better understanding of the work. The whole purpose of this process is to create a platform for discussion and understanding. It's not necessarily meant to define everything to the exact moment. So, how does it work? I think this is what a lot of times people want to see. It's like, well, how does this is so weird. I'm just looking at graphs, I'm looking at numbers, I'm looking at lines. How does it actually work? So this is a graph of a simple life drawing. So everybody's done life drawings before, right? We've all done that, no problem. This graph is a graph of the content of the life drawing. What it's basically showing us is that each one of these lines have been moved along a particular point. And this is signification, this is experiential, this is the technique, and this represents our structure. Each one of these lines, if they move closer to the subject, it tells us something about this particular work. A subject that is highly framed is usually a work that is fairly literal in terms of what it's doing for us. There's not a lot of openness in the read itself. It's going to communicate something very specific to us. If I were to map, say, a work for graphic design, I probably would have a similar kind of framing structure for it. Other forms that have a high level of representation and their message is very, very succinct usually have very tight framing structures. So graphing this information gives us another way to understand how artwork works. Now, what a lot of people get upset with is the idea that we can actually graph artwork, that artwork can be quantified in some way. That seems to be totally antithetical to art. But it does allow us to do that. Other kinds of works, for example, this particular work is called The Green Dream, and these are all student works, by the way. So this shows a nice open frame. So in this case, it has the technique on this particular piece is quite high. It's a fairly polished piece of work in terms of its refinements. You're not going to find anything that's not pretty darn clean on this particular piece of work. But if we look at, say, its structure, it's actually, or signification, they don't move in quite as close to it. So other kinds of things are going on based on the terms of choice by the artist that I showed you in terms of activation. A more open frame tends to indicate to us that the work has more room for interpretation by the viewer. It has more room for interpretation in terms of how we understand and experience that work, particularly in this piece right here. Another work doing the same thing. I mentioned something, I forget, we had one of the crits, we were talking about terms. One of the things that we see with a piece like this one, it's called Solar Flare. It's actually a drawing. It's a kind of an experimental drawing in one way in the sense of the way it's made. This particular drawing was made by burning matches in a particular, in this concentric circle and ring. Papers actually has holes burned into it. But the title itself sort of redirects some of the experimentation, taking us away from some of the experimental, because it literally now becomes much more representational because of what the title is doing to it. So titles can shift the way the mapping system can actually work sometimes. If the title is more abstract, more open, as opposed to more literal, more closed, it can change the read of the work for us. This is a piece that was done by a student called, the title of the piece was called Process. The student was very, very insistent that his work was about work, it was about process, it was about the making of things. This is what the work was about. We see a very interesting and tight framing structure. What we have is a very low level of signification with this work. It's physical, it's experiential, but it was experiential in a way that didn't necessarily, it wasn't a critical piece, it wasn't informing you of anything, it certainly wasn't social in nature, but it it sets up a different kind of dynamic, and this particular graph indicates that the work probably isn't anything about what it's being titled. The title and the work seem to be somewhat different than one another. The other aspect of this mapping process, in addition to mapping the subject, is once we know that there is a subject, once we know that the artist, and we're able to identify that there's a subject at work, even though there may be divergent ideas about what that subject really is, we can now look to see where that work of art kind of seats itself within the discursive space of our model. And in this case, we're concerned with conveyance and contextual identification. Our conditions of conveyance, the ability to convey information, occur along three primary lines or transoms: the social, the disciplinary, and the material. The social represents narrative. Discipline is a form of integration for us, so the disciplinary. And then the material, another term we're using for this right now is the sensorial, that physical sensorial. We try not to overlap too many terms. Sometimes that becomes a problem, having the same term pop up in 3 or 4 spots of our model. It gets confusing for someone else to understand why is physical in here 5 times. So we try to look for other language that will assist us in being both specific and yet at the same time not having to use the same term multiple times. On one side of this line, as you saw earlier, we were quantitative. On the other side, we are qualitative. Our quantitative, literal, hierarchical, alignment. Qualitative aspects are the abstract, resonance, and coherence. Now I'll show you how that works. Each one of these allow us to create or qualify one of our 8 contextual quadrants. Each one of these quadrants contains this information, but it contains it in a different order. And that's what allows us to define these contextual quadrants. So each quadrant that we have, the phenomenological quadrant, the quadrant for process, informational, operational, relational, rebroadcast, performativity, and conceptual, all have information that defines what they're about. So they work in a certain way. So when we're determining content, these lines are broken up, as you remember, with content, and these are the terms that are associated with these lines. Once again, I'm asking you basically a series of questions, or you would be asking yourself questions about your own work or about someone else's work. Is this work more literal? Is this work more abstract? Does this work from a disciplinary perspective use hierarchical conditions, or does it use resonance as a way to pull the work together and allow it to exist? In terms of the material or our sensorial kind of effect, is it about alignment or is it about coherence? So let's go back and look at the artworks that I just showed you a second ago, and let's put them into a contextual location if the computer allows it. So this is our life drawing again. It's a very literal work, okay? So it's quantitative in terms of its narrative. In terms of its disciplinary condition, it's hierarchical, still quantitative. And in terms of its material condition, it's also about an alignment of information and material. So when we look at this particular quadrant, and I would have to back up to the quadrants, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to go backwards. It falls into what we refer to as our operational quadrant. And part of this has to do with the pedagogical ideas behind life drawing and why we have life drawing sitting in our curriculum today, why you take life drawing classes. It serves certain skill sets. It's supposed to develop memory. It's supposed to develop motor skills. It's supposed to develop your sense of scale, proportion, your eye, these kinds of things. So life drawing as an image might map out slightly differently than this, but life drawing within the context of curricular structure and those kinds of things ends up being a very quantitative condition, and as a result, it has an operational kind of outcome. It's supposed to do something, and it does do the thing it's supposed to do, and that's why we have it in place. Let's look at another piece of work. This was the Green Dream. And this particular piece maps out into the conceptual quadrant. It's a work that is qualitative in terms of its narrative condition because it's more abstract. So the abstraction opens us up to the understanding. It's dealing with the idea of dream, it's dealing with the idea of the imagination, it's dealing with certain kinds of aspects of artificiality, the idea of the sky, but the sky is an image, it's not real. The grass itself, on the other hand, is a real material, growing. And so there are these contradictions to the whole notion of the image that we're looking at. In terms of its disciplinary condition, the artists made a choice. They decided that they were going to make a work that was more hierarchical in nature. It functions within the space of sculpture as we understand it. You know, someone's not going to walk up to this in a gallery and go, I have no idea what I'm looking at. So they've used certain disciplinary strategies, such as installation and formal presentation, to orchestrate the work. So that makes it more of a more deeply embedded into the discipline. So they use the discipline to help, because the work may not be self-referential outside of it, but they use that disciplinary space to help give it a sense of sculptural position in terms of the idea behind it. And the material choices were aligning up literally with the idea itself. There's the sky above, there's the light, there's the white box, there's the wood on the bottom, the natural finish, the green grass. So there are a whole series of material alignments that sort of fit the idea, and they line up very nicely, and they need to line up. You know, it's not purple paint and glitter and astroturf. It becomes a completely different work if it goes into that direction, okay? Even if we kept all the same sort of formal structure and we change that, it literally changes the whole meaning of the work and its contextual placement as well. Another kind of work also ends up in the conceptual space, and this one was titled Bullet. It's the use of, you know, you're transferring it into the text, the idea of the message. Once again, we see the same kind of setup. And you have to understand, had those been carved wooden pieces, had it been just a photograph rather than the objects themselves, it's that relationship of materials that allow these things to line up. If it had been real bullets with something maybe etched on the side, I don't know if it would map out in quite the same place. So the choices made by the artist can make a really interesting shift in the contextual placement of the work. This one becomes, from the way we were working through it, becomes a piece that's informational in nature. There's an experimental quality to the way it was made, but when you think about what it does now, the moment you see solar flare, it's very difficult to remove other kinds of images of sun and of the solar flare and that whole concept. And we have access to those kinds of images as part of our cultural space, our world. Those images readily are called up the moment someone says something. We get a trigger, a flood of images. So the title in this case can actually redirect the thinking. It's an example of redirecting the thinking within the work. And to put us into the informational space basically is a shifting from hierarchy to resonance. We need that in terms of the discipline as a condition of integration. We need it to resonate, and that'll shift us over into the informational quadrant, those 8 quadrants that I talked about. And the one that was supposed to be all about process was, interestingly enough, comes in as what our quadrant called reception and rebroadcast. And this is a very common place for a lot of artwork, actually. We find a large portion of the artwork falls into, in general, falls into two primary categories, the relational and the reception and rebroadcast quadrant. This particular piece, if you notice, to fall into that category, it's abstract in nature, where the artist had to go back and rely deeply into the discipline to get us to, so there's a formal use of construction and the spacing of it where it's being shown to get us to understand what we're looking at in the first place. It could have been made out of any material. I mean, this could have been a paper piece, wood piece, it could have been made out of wire, I mean, feathers, and you name it. You could stick them all together and make a work kind of like this in terms of its physical orientation in space. So we end up with coherence because it didn't require strict alignment back to the idea. And that shifts us into the space of reception and rebroadcast. What's really interesting, if you look at other artists' works outside of these, one of the quadrants we have the hardest time putting work into is the phenomenological quadrant. We've only found a few artworks that fall into that quadrant, and we've tried to map, I don't know how many, into it. We find that artifacts go into the phenomenological quadrant quite readily. The only artwork that comes to mind right off the top of my head that I know we've mapped into that space, and I don't remember the artist's name, it was the person that did the cloud piece, where they've set up the instrumentation to make clouds inside the gallery. I don't remember the artist's name. Does anybody remember that person? It's a very technical piece. What's interesting about that piece is that it only really functions as art because, well, it's in a gallery. You can imagine that same piece over in a science center, and we would map it into the informational quadrant. But in an art gallery made by that artist as a work of art, it mapped into the phenomenological. What's that? No.
Which is the? I mean, there was also some architects that made the blur building. It's not Diller Scofidio?
Yeah. This literally was something.
They figured out how to make a cloud. And when you're in the gallery, it's a cloud. It's amazing in terms of the physical effect that it produces.
Eliasson would not be somebody that would map into the phenomenological?
Burns now,
What?
Dutch?
Yeah, it's a Dutch artist, isn't it? Yeah. So
Eliasson would not be somebody that mapped into phenomenological?
I'd have to look at the work.
Some of Eliasson's works?
Maybe I'd have to go through and map those pieces.
Actually, probably the only one is the sun that he made it take.
The sun?
So
Created sunlight.
I guess the way, and this is the after moment, you've seen all the crashes, but the way to think about this is that the whole notion of our initial focus was this research-based approach. What is research? How does art work? What is art in the first place? And can we use all of the things we know about art and then just basically box it up and stick it into something that's called research and then send it out the door because that's the new thing that we're doing. And essentially what we've come to understand, at least from my perspective, is that it actually works differently. Like the way I learned to make artwork prior to this understanding was really different than the way I might make artwork with this. To begin with, I rarely ever ask myself what's the subject of my work. I just grabbed some materials and I kind of started working. And with the faith that something good was going to come out of that effort at some point in time down the road, right? This particular system is kind of nice in the sense that it allows you to identify a subject and as a result play around with the contextual placement of your work and think about where you might want to posit that work. And if you don't want it to go into one place, but you want it to be in another space, you can look at some of the conditions based on the terms that are used and their definitions about what that means, and then think about how to shift it into a different direction. At the very beginning of the talk, I mentioned there were like maybe 3 classes of objects. There are probably more than that, I'm sure. But so the everyday object, generally an everyday object only maps into one quadrant, the operational. They do what they're supposed to do. That's all they're supposed to do, if they're doing what they're supposed to do. Decorative-based objects, which may contain other information and narratives that have been built into them because of either the history of the designs and that are being imparted on them, or possibly visual and other text-based information, can find themselves in 2 quadrants. And then so far, most art objects that we've worked with are in 3 or more quadrants simultaneously. So they have, depending on how they're being positioned and what they're doing, they can take in more than one space at a time, which is the reason we think about them as being this sort of multi-dimensional condition as a work of art, having these special criteria and these special conditions. And that's it for you guys. Yeah, hit us.
We
I know,
have a microphone.
Who has the mic?
We have a microphone.
But you got the question too? I don't know why that. Okay, good. I don't
one at a time. The first one's probably super easy. Just the relationship of, especially what you were talking about, Saul, to like Platonic reality. Are you guys simply trying to describe like the Platonic art object in reality? Are you seeking out the ideal thing and defining it? Or trying to?
Not having thought about that before, my initial response would be no. What we were attempting to do was describe a potentiality that, in the notion that anything it comes to be represented by an index, not in any Platonic manner, not in any ideal manner. It's not that the work of art need include all these things. It's that works of art potentially include some of these things.
I have a follow-up. The mic may be right in between for the microphone. This was, oh yeah, move closer, fantastic. So the subject of any work of art is something you're trying to find. In that case, this is a conversation I was having earlier today, and your answer could change my opinion on this. Is the subject, if the artwork already exists, is it that something's discovered, right? Or is it something applied after the fact, arbitrarily? That question should be broader than that. I've really narrowed it down by asking it out loud. In my mind, it was much more broader. This is through the context of there being no beginning, right? Things have a beginning, middle, or before, during, and after, and they don't start at the beginning. You start in the middle. So it's something discovered and then worked around. You can both answer.
Go ahead and answer. I've got a mic.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by discovered. The proposition here is that subject is the organizing principle. Things get organized around that subject.
So if the subject is the organizing principle, are the things around that, whether they are, the vehicle or...
Can you go to the diagram of the frame?
Which one?
Of the frame, the framing device, where, in terms of proving that there's a subject at the center of it all?
Here?
No.
The animation?
No, keep going. Keep going. There. That little white dot is if it's a subject, has gravity, and begins to order the decisions around it.
All right. So the final part. Sorry. Are there zeros?
In this, yes, there are. The zeros actually are at the center of this. It's a 0, 0, 0.
What is
And
that?
it's what we refer to as the state of all possible options. Yes.
Well, it's actually we used to talk about it as a null point.
No point.
But we also refer to it within an acronym of SOAPs.
Absolutely.
The state of all possible solutions. The thing you're asking about the subject is basically another way to organize your thought around that is that the subject exists of content. Content can be broken down from a semiotic perspective into the vehicle and the topic. The vehicle is what we already know. We all have information. We've experienced stuff, we've read stuff, we've talked to people, we've got stuff inside of us, right? But whenever you're trying to figure out your next move, you start from what you know and begin to collect things to define your topic. That topic is that new information that reinforms what you have to work with, that vehicle you have to move things with. Once you get these things starting to sort of coalesce and you pull enough information together, you're beginning to establish real content. Enough content will give you a subject. You know, it's like, what do you want to make work about? Oh, I want to make work about infinity. Oh, that's a really big topic. How would we like to make work about infinity, right? Or I'm making work about the ocean. Which one? You know, top, bottom, middle. We're talking about the fish. We're talking about the water. What part of the ocean, right? So that's the topic that has to come to terms with. I'd really like to make work about the ocean. What about the ocean? I'm not really sure. As that information begins to coalesce and become defined through your research and your searching of information, you start to establish the content. Ultimately, you're going to identify a very specific subject. Moving out into this condition of expression, starting to understand what you need to convey and how you will convey it, is going to force you through this reflexive and recursive process back over here again. And we do this iteration time and time again. It's also why we make more than one piece about the same thing. It's why we work in series. It's why we investigate multiples, because that one model or that one representation of an idea that's got all these possibilities, it usually can't hold them all. But it's also why it holds more than one kind of meaning within it. And it's what makes an art object particularly special compared to other objects.
Keeping all these ideas in mind, how do you go about actually making anything?
Okay, I guess that one's addressed to me, right? I take one of two basic approaches. I either, if I don't know if I don't have a subject in mind, right, I'm like, I will go into my studio and literally take material and probably reduce it into smaller component parts. So sometimes my work will initiate itself just simply working through certain materials or certain drawing processes and forms. I don't have the idea in my mind at that moment. But while I'm doing that, I'm constantly looking out and beginning to look at topics of information that I want. So sometimes material process and building things is just simply a way to keep me physically interactive, and maybe even the word occupied sometimes, until I start to really focus in on what I'm doing. Most of my work starts, though, by establishing a subject from which to start actually building something with.
What I was going to say is that, it's not necessarily a constructive method, it's also a retrospective.
Yes, yes.
In fact, it's probably
More
primarily a
retrospective.
method, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, you use it as a place to start, and you even said very much in your presentation about the device querying us,
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can be free of it, or you can use it as you wish.
Right. It's simply a tool. Think of it as a tool. And it won't tell you what you're supposed to make, because you have to ask the questions. You have to provide it with some information before it can even give you a chance to, because all it does is map stuff for you. You're like, well, what if I use this and I want to do this? It's like, oh, that could contextually place it here. Well, what's the meaning behind this space based on this model? How does it describe this location? I really don't want my work to be about information. It's not an informational piece. I realize I'm making choices that are putting it there. I really want the work to be more conceptually oriented. I need to get here. How do I get there? What's defining concept and conceptual within the model? You could...
Well, one of the other things you said that was very interesting when you had the photographs up is that this claimed to be this, but turned out to be that.
Right. And
that's a good...
Saul probably taught me that one like early on. He told me all artists lie. So
whether consciously or not.
Well, or to themselves or others.
Yeah, to the
So I accept that that I lie a lot to myself. But one of the reasons that I like this tool sometimes is that it lets me sort of we realized it would give us a chance to get distance on what we were trying to figure out and interrogate our own ideas. But once we realized it could do that, we started to apply it to other things. Initially, we weren't applying this tool to anything but our research and these assumptions that we had made and the theories that we would put out, because it'd be like, well, these are great ideas. They look really cool. Do they work? Is this right? We couldn't ask it. So this particular structure manifested itself as a means to interrogate our own assumptions within this first project that we were doing. It then grew into a tool, and other kinds of apparatus have come out of it that let you ask questions and delineate information. You could get a group of people sitting at a table, a couple of artists, an engineer, finance person, they've got a project they want to do. Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? How do you get a group of people to talk about an idea when none of them have a place but their own personal space with which to understand it? One way is to make a model of it, physical model. Another way is to make images of it and say, do you like this? Another way is to be able to really talk about what it does and how it does what it does, which is what this tool allows. So it's a way also of basically objectifying information. There's a question or two.
Since you've kind of conceptualized this, have you noticed a difference in your work in the classification of work before or after? Like a difference? Yeah. Before or after, and where did they usually fall?
Part of it is I am deliberately trying to make work more recently, say since this came about, I started looking to try to make work that would be both about something and the thing in itself. And I had no idea how to do that. But this thing allowed me to start to answer some of those questions on how to make something that was both about something and the thing in itself. So, and sculptural objects sometimes have that capacity, not always, but there's a potential for sculpture. I knew it was there because historically there are objects that are both these art objects and yet they also have a functional aspect to them as well, particularly in the marriage of art and architecture, or sculpture and architectural spaces. So I knew it was there. The question is, how is it there and what would it be? So yeah, I've used it for that before and was happy to have it.
So you had mentioned with the phenomenological piece that's rare to map, that the setting was really what made it phenomenological artwork and not science. How do you factor that place of presentation into, because that artwork could be presented in a different setting?
It could. A lot of artwork today doesn't have a capacity to reference itself. It has no self-referential capacity at all. The beauty of the history of the discipline, if you do a bronze whatever, let's say it's a bronze figurative piece. I could stick it in the woods. We could leave it half sticking out of the water down at the river. People are like, oh, look, there's a statue stuck in the water. There's a statue I found in the woods. Take a piece that's made, it's a collection of styrofoam that's then put into a space. Yeah, with our Alan Sonfis work is an excellent example with Time Landscape. Is that? It was a piece that was incredibly well organized. It's a garden, essentially, in New York. And
You guys have all walked by it.
yeah,
I guarantee you, every one of you has walked by it.
If you've ever been on the corner of Houston and West Broadway,
you walked past
you
it.
stood next to it.
But today, it's just a little small plot that's completely overgrown. The only thing that signifies it is a plaque. So it lacks technique today. There's no sign of any human interaction. Structurally, it's almost impossible to identify. It still provides an experience. It's one of an overgrown space, whatever that experience is. But it can no longer function as a work of art itself, but it has a plaque, and that plaque connects back to the documentation that still allows that work to exist through that form. That's a good, in and of itself right now, it's not self-referential by itself. It needs that legacy to allow us to understand that we're still looking at a work.
But there's also the other example that you often use, which is when a painting stops being art and becomes an antique.
Yeah, at what
Lost
point?
its frame.
How do you quantify when that happens? Or
Well, can different works, you identify it at different times, and then there's aspects in terms where sometimes things get resurrected.
So wait, is Bouguereau an antique?
Yeah.
Bouguereau was an
Antique.
antique and has come back.
Yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
And it's
come
become
back.
totally
You're right.
recontextualized.
Right.
And if you wanted to show that on our mapping system, one of the ways that we would show that is that work originally would have fallen into a particular contextual quadrant, and we could show it. At some point, it ceased to be mappable by this system because it was, or at least as an art object, it won't show up. It doesn't have the subject capacity to do that. It would literally sort of wink out of existence. But then again, it could be resurrected by a curator, by the critic, by
Historicity or something.
there is, and that's another format that can frame the work. Some works lack self-referentiality is probably the easiest way to answer that, but it's more complex than just that simple statement, if that makes sense. So the gallery is a major framing device for us. Curators, critics, writers of all kinds that write about the work. If you think about it, if you go the other way, then you're left with a tautology. I'm an artist, I make art. I make art because I'm an artist. Therefore, you can't question anything that I do. So that little circle is...
Oh, wrap
yeah.
it up? Okay, all right. I have one last question. It's kind of a flip question. And, but of course you used a hypercube. Why couldn't you use all kinds of other geometric models for the, the hypercube works really well, why couldn't you use other models? Like the event horizon or something like that?
The reason...
Kind of funny.
Yeah, it would be, wouldn't it? I'll be honest with you, the reason I used the tesseract and the hypercube was because this project reminded me in certain aspects of the compass are actually built on ideas from Duchamp's large glass. And the large glass and Duchamp's work on the large glass was initially influenced by Riemannian geometry and the ideas around 4D space. And so I gravitated to the tesseract and those ideas of four-dimensionality because of Duchamp's early work and use of it in the large glass.